Good evening, everybody. A warm welcome tonight to the 10th and final event in the Presidential Lecture Series on Technology and the Human Future. I could not be more delighted to end our series with tonight's guest, Jon Iwata. There is a certain symmetry and poetry to his being our last speaker. Many of you will remember that Seth Farbman gave the first lecture of the series in December, and the last will be accomplished tonight by his colleague and friend, Jon. And a warm welcome as well to all the faithful AUP students, members of our new master's program, members of faculty and staff, trustees and former trustees in our cyber audience. So Jon Iwata is executive fellow at the Yale School of Management, in that sense, a colleague of Seth's, an appointment that he received upon his retirement from IBM in 2018, capping a 35-year career with the company. At IBM, Jon reported to 3 CEOs during 2 decades of significant transformation of the information technology industry, global business, and geopolitics. As IBM Senior Vice President of Marketing and Communications, he led the company's global marketing, communications, and corporate citizenship organization for over a decade. According to Interbrand, IBM became the second most valuable brand in the world during Jon's tenure as CMO. Also, Jon's current work at Yale is now focused on understanding how business leadership is evolving in the era of stakeholder capitalism. Jon is also executive director of the Data and Trust Alliance, a consortium formed in 2020 by leading companies to develop and promote responsible data and AI practices and policies. Most of you attending tonight have been with us since the beginning of all 10 lectures, so I'm going to keep this part of my introduction short. This is a reminder that this series is focused on the impact of the rapidly expanding role of technology in and about and just about everywhere in human life. Over the past 4 months, speakers have taken the measure of the dangers inherent in unregulated technology, but they've also suggested ways in which technology, properly governed, can be transformative of our lives. Jon's lecture tonight positions itself precisely amongst all of those issues from the vantage point of business and public trust. Jon will elaborate tonight on how AI, one of the most powerful tools humankind has ever created, has the potential to create profound economic and societal value if used wisely. However, it can also create or do great harm. And as such, business has an inherent responsibility to ensure that new technologies are used in ways that earn public trust. He will provide an example of how a group of major companies came together to fight bias in AI systems. And since we've given Jon the last word tonight, he will also end with some words of advice for how to proceed, especially to the students here, how to proceed in this brave new world of big data, biased data, and vulnerable data. We are honored to feature Jon as spokesman for the Data and Trust Alliance at this last meeting. I think it will be heartening for everyone gathered to hear about the progress made by the Alliance as we consider how business is actually stepping forward. And this is really runs parallel to what we know about the field of environmentalism as well, where business has moved forward decisively, sometimes faster than governments, to do important regulation, self-regulation. As always in the discussions after our lectures, we'll be considering together with our speakers our own responsibility for understanding and critiquing the role of technology in our lives. As Jon gives his presentation, please feel free to begin putting your questions in the chat. I'll start with him as soon as he concludes. And I'd like to ask all of you, if possible, to keep your cameras on once he finishes his PowerPoint, just because it's nicer for the speaker to see your lovely faces and your reactions. So over to you, Jon, with bated breath.
Thank you very much, Celeste. I appreciate this opportunity to speak with all of you and to conclude your lecture series, which I found profoundly interesting. We're going to talk about everything that Celeste mentioned, and I want to start, I have some charts here to share. Let me get those fired up. And I want to start by talking about artificial intelligence and what it is and what it's not. 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 And what it is and what And I want, because there's so many misconceptions about artificial intelligence, not from the standpoint of the underlying technologies, but just how we think about it as people. And it's important for us to ground this in the reality that, among other things, artificial intelligence is another tool in a long history of tools that a civilization has created to help us do things that augment our abilities as humans. And if you think about the tools that people have created that are in use today, that extend or augment our abilities, they're quite profound. This is the Da Vinci surgical system, a robotical system that's used increasingly in hospitals. What does it do? It doesn't replace the surgeon, but it augments the human surgeon's abilities to perform very intricate surgical procedures that humans with our fingers cannot. A trained surgeon can be accurate by hand to up to about 100 micrometers. With the Da Vinci, they can extend that to 50 micrometers. And some 7 million surgical operations to date, as far as I could find, have been completed thanks to this extension of surgeons' abilities. This is on your continent. This is the largest machine in the world. This is the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, 27-kilometer ring. It has just come back online. And this is a profound machine because it allows us to see things as people that we cannot see in the fundamental building blocks of the universe. You probably know that in 2012, this machine allowed scientists to discover the Higgs boson, which is considered one of the fundamental elements of the universe. And with this upgradation, researchers hope to make even more discoveries, including the nature of dark matter. That's probing into subatomic, the world of the atom. But at the other extreme, in December of this past year, the James Webb Space Telescope finally was launched into space. It has been positioned successfully. It has been cooled successfully. And this is going to extend our ability as humans to see into the universe, actually see into time in ways that we can never do that, of course, with the human eye. This is going to allow humans to look back more than 13 billion years into how the first stars and galaxies were formed. And this telescope is 100 times more powerful than the Hubble Space Telescope, which itself was a revolution. Now, I've picked these tools not because they're simply powerful, but they are extensions of our abilities. They can do things that we cannot do with our fingers, with our eyes, with our ears. They augment and hopefully improve and hopefully correct for imperfections in humans. But this lecture is about, I think, perhaps the most powerful tool that we have given birth to as humans. And it is not in space, it is not in the ground. It is in our hands, quite literally. And it's going to be in everything around us. It's going to be embedded in the systems of the world, both man-made and natural. It's going to interact with us in ways that are everyday and in business. And that is the phenomenon of data and artificial intelligence. They are conjoined. You often hear about data, big data, our data, personal data, privacy. And then there's this artificial intelligence and algorithms and the ability of machines to learn on their own. These are not separate topics. In fact, AI is not new. AI, as I'll describe here, is a concept that is decades old, but why are we now experiencing it and will increasingly experience it in everyday life? And it's because of data. Data, as you know, is growing every second of the day in volume and in variety. A chart like this is now several years old, but it's still accurate. We're just at the beginning of this data phenomenon. It's coming off of our devices. It's coming off of every instrument. It's coming off of our interactions with the internet, with each other, social media. All of these things are throwing off data. And the data can reveal very powerful insights if used with responsibility. Let me ask you to think about this, because in the same way that the Da Vinci surgical robot and the Webb Space Telescope extend our abilities as people, AI does that in a very particular area, and that is in how we make decisions. Some people think AI is like something you talk to, or it's some kind of replacement for us. And that's a different debate, which we can have this evening if you'd like. But if you think about it principally as an extension of our decision-making capabilities, let's talk about some decisions that you and I make every day. Now, without overthinking it, why do you buy what you buy on any given day? If you're walking down the street and you decide to buy something, what influences your decision? Why do you buy what you buy? Well, perhaps you're thinking of things like this. You buy what you buy because you see it. That's proximity. You buy what you buy because suddenly it's on sale, or you fear it's going to be more expensive tomorrow, very likely with inflation coming back. You buy what you buy because other people are talking about it. You buy what you buy because you have a loyalty program with your credit card, or with an airline, or with a store. And often overlooked, you buy an umbrella because it just started to rain and you forgot to bring an umbrella. Well, these are all factors that drive a very everyday decision, wouldn't you say? And that is our buying behavior. These are not new. This is not new. What is new is this. You see, these things, which have maybe always been true about purchase decisions, now are captured as data. And these facts are probably already out of date. But you see, we didn't know what people were talking about. Now we do. It's called social media. We couldn't predict the weather with any kind of confident accuracy. We certainly can. We didn't know where you were walking down the street, but we can now if you have a wearable or a smartphone and you leave geolocation on. You see, these things which bear on a very important decision, which is why we buy things. Now we can know these things and therefore can predict what decisions people will make. By the way, everything on the right side of this chart, think of them as data sets. It's not just data. These are discrete sets of data coming from things like wearable devices and internet. He said, for another vital decision that you and I make all the time. And sometimes they literally are life and death. But think about it. What do you think bears on your health? Whether to keep you healthy or why you get sick? What are the things that bear on your health? Well, perhaps you're thinking about these things. My genetic makeup, whether or not I exercise enough, and I don't exercise enough. My sleep habits, certainly my diet, the kinds of tests that indicate what I should do, my family history, all of these things you see bear on our health and our wellness. That's not new. That's not new. Here's what's new. All of these things are now captured as data. Even our sleeping habits, our genetic makeup, of course, our exercise regimen. So if you use a Peloton, which I should use my Peloton more often, if I leave my wearable device on at night, which I do, if I, all of these things you see, these are relevant data sets that bear on a decision, either a decision I make, a decision my physician makes, and so forth. And with the data comes the promise of more accurate, more precise, more anticipatory decisions. I think you'd agree that there is a very real and often terrible price that we pay for decisions that are not accurate, that are imprecise, that lack precision, and that come too late. The promise of AI, at least in this dimension that I'm arguing, is that the accuracy of decisions will increase and the cost of making a prediction which supports decisions will drop to almost zero. Now, artificial intelligence, as I mentioned to you, is not a new concept. And I'm not going to bore you with the history of AI, but I'm trying to convey to you that there is something different about the AI that we are seeing today and that's being massively invested in. You see here, the term artificial intelligence is from the middle of the last century. So if smart people proposed this idea, began to do research in the idea of artificial intelligence, how come it's only now in the 21st century that you and I are talking about it? Well, part of it is what they thought initially artificial intelligence was. And they thought it was, as you see here in this term here, an artificial intelligence system was an expert system, literally an expert system. So what did they try to do? They said, well, let's take an expert like a physician, a doctor, and let's sit down with doctors and capture their knowledge. How do you as a doctor make decisions? And let's take all of those if then, and build into a software system. Could work, advance, but of course, all of these things do. Epidemics happen, pandemics happen, new pharmaceuticals come about, clinical trials come about, knowledge expands. And this attempt to build artificial intelligence through expert systems collapsed because these systems simply don't change. They would always have to be updated. They would always be limited. And so AI entered a kind of winter. Sometimes you hear about it as the AI winter. And as we started to head into this century, a new attempt was made in artificial intelligence, and that was systems that learn. And this is why you'll hear artificial intelligence often equated with machine learning and deep learning. These are systems that learn. How do they learn? They learn from data. The fact that data now is being captured from all of our interactions and all of our devices has created this enormous amount of raw material that learning systems, machine learning systems, deep learning systems can ingest to find patterns, to find correlations, and basically based on that, make predictions based on prior patterns. So I come back to what I would like you to suggest that you think about, among other things. Before I do this, think about the internet. Think about the internet. Some of you will never know a time in your life when the internet didn't exist, but some of us do remember when the internet didn't exist. What did the internet actually change? Well, that's a long discussion, but here's one fact that is irrefutable. The internet took the cost of a transaction to almost zero. And because it was almost zero or free, we were able to make transactions over the internet ubiquitous. What you and I are doing this evening is a kind of transaction, right? It is the ability to exchange knowledge and information and to communicate. Obviously, from the pandemic, we were able to execute all manner of transactions over the internet at almost no cost and in every dimension of transaction, from commerce to education to government services, on and on. So from a purely what actually changed, one can argue that the cost of a transaction almost went to zero, and therefore it became ubiquitous. What's going to happen with this AI revolution? One, the cost of making a prediction, any kind of prediction. What will you buy? What is your health going to be? The supply chain, predicting, is that a cat versus a dog video? Is that a deer in the road? Should my car turn left by itself or turn right? The cost of a prediction will come to almost zero, while the accuracy of a prediction will approach 100%, and it will become ubiquitous. Just like transactions in the internet, predictions will be everywhere and they'll be increasingly accurate. That sounds good, doesn't it? But is it really a future that we want? If a company can predict what its customers want with greater accuracy, that seems to be a good thing. If you could predict the progression of a disease and therefore do something about it, that seems to be a good thing. But there are also things in here that are troubling. And it isn't that AI will take over the world or AI attains some kind of sentience and so forth. Again, we can talk about that if you'd like to. But the potential of making bad decisions or us turning over to AI decision-making entirely, having bias coming into decisions, having unfair decisions made. See, these things really are concerns, and they are entirely possible if we just let the systems do their thing without the appropriate checks and balances. And I do want to talk about that. So as Celeste mentioned, among other things that I'm doing today, I helped to form, and now I lead as the executive director, a consortium of companies. This is called the Data and Trust Alliance. Relatively new. It was formed at the very beginning of the pandemic in 2020 by a core group of companies. You see here many brands that I trust you recognize. Yes, it is US centric for now. We hope to be more of a global organization over time. It is cross-industry, as you can see here, from financial services to sports, to consumer beverages, to healthcare, to technology, pharmaceuticals, and the like. We came together because the CEOs of these companies are all staking the futures of their companies in some way on the use of data and artificial intelligence. But they recognize that there are lots of unanswered questions and potential harms that can be created unless companies also take the time to refine practices, develop practices to demonstrate the responsible use of these technologies. And that's what we do. We don't write white papers and create principles and lobby governments, things like that. We are all about practical implementation. What can we create that can actually be put into operation inside of companies? And we operate at this intersection of real world use cases. That's kind of a wonky term here, but like applications, real applications in business, as I'll illustrate, and also enablers. Enablers are data and AI and policy and good governance. And that's what we focus on. We have one measurement of success, or KPI, key performance indicator, and that is adoption. We want to create things that can actually be adopted by various kinds of business professionals and technical professionals in business today. Let me give you an illustration of one of the projects that we did, our first project, our first major project. And let me set the stage here by sharing with you a short clip of a TED Talk given by Zeynep Tufekci, who is a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And if you listen to her here, you'll get a clear sense of one aspect of potential harm if not addressed. So let's listen to Zeynep.
Here's why. Currently, computational systems can infer all sorts of things about you from your digital crumbs, even if you have not disclosed those things. They can infer your sexual orientation, your personality traits, your political leanings. They have predictive power with high levels of accuracy. Remember, for things you haven't even disclosed, this is inference. I have a friend who developed such computational systems to predict the likelihood of clinical or postpartum depression from social media data. The results are impressive. Her system can predict the likelihood of depression months before the onset of any symptoms. Months before. No symptoms, there's prediction. She hopes it'll be used for early intervention. Great. But now put this in the context of hiring. So at this Human Resources Managers Conference, I approached a high-level manager in a very large company. And I said to her, look, what if, unbeknownst to you, your system is weeding out people with high future likelihood of depression? They're not depressed now, just maybe in the future, more likely. What if it's weeding out women more likely to be pregnant in the next year or two, but aren't pregnant now? What if it's hiring aggressive people because that's your workplace culture? You can't tell this by looking at gender breakdowns. Those may be balanced. And since this is machine learning, not traditional coding, there is no variable there labeled higher risk of depression, higher risk of pregnancy, aggressive guy scale. Not only do you not know what your system is selecting on, you don't even know where to begin to look. It's a black box. It has predictive power, but you don't understand it. What safeguards, I asked, do you have to make sure that your black box isn't doing something shady? So she looked at me as if I had just stepped on 10 puppy tails. She stared at me and she said, I don't want to hear another word about this. She turned around and walked away. Mind you, she wasn't rude. It was clearly, what I don't know isn't my problem, go away, death stare. Look, such a system may even be less biased than human managers in some ways. And it could make monetary sense. But it could also lead to a steady but stealthy shutting out of the job market of people with higher risk of depression. Is this the kind of society we want to build without even knowing we've done this because we turn decision-making to machines we don't totally understand?
Okay, so you get the context here. That scenario or those scenarios that she described here are very real. You know, they could happen. But you notice the question she asked to an HR leader and a very unfortunate answer she got. The question is, what safeguards do you have in place? Well, I saw this TED Talk clip just the other day in preparing for this lecture, but it fit very nicely because more than a year ago, as we began to become operational as an organization, our member companies and I quickly identified this need, which is algorithmic safety in the context of hiring, or rather all the decisions that are made as regards to employees or workforce. This is an area that is increasing. And you need to be aware of this because you're all, if you're not today employed, you probably will be in the future. When you go to apply for a position, when you're evaluated for a position, will there be AI working in the background, selecting your CV, evaluating your interview, recommending you for promotion, recommending certain compensation packages for you, recommending career paths for you, recommending healthcare benefits for you. What we learned in working with our companies is that, yes, in fact, they are all using data and algorithmic systems across the spectrum of workforce decisions. We also learned that they are concerned about this potential for bias being introduced into these systems in ways that no one perhaps intended. And I have to say, unfair bias. Isn't all bias unfair? Well, this is semantics, but if I said to you, we want to hire somebody who speaks French, is that bias? Well, maybe. But if I said to you, why did the system screen out people who speak French? Well, I didn't want that. So that's an unfair bias being introduced into a system. So so when I use the term bias, I mean unfair bias. So our learning here is that these companies are using these systems or getting access to this kind of decision-making support through their vendors, through companies that sell to them products and services. Either they are technology vendors or they're traditional HR vendors, workforce vendors, that they themselves are using data and AI. And what we found is that our companies that are part of the alliance, they needed to have a way of evaluating whether the companies that want to do business with them, whether those companies have in place safeguards, ways of detecting and mitigating unfair bias. To build this out, we spoke with experts inside of our companies, in civil society, in academia, in the vendor community, to make sure that what we were building was relevant, accurate, and implementable. And we ended up building this, which are anti-bias safeguards for workforce decisions. And these are now in place in more than a dozen of our member companies, including Walmart, which is the second largest employer in the United States. And you notice here, I'm not going to walk you through all of this, but it is a way of evaluating vendors based on questions and scoring their answers, and also of providing education for the HR and procurement colleagues. The evaluation is very detailed here. You see there are 55 questions and 13 categories, and it needs to be detailed because the companies need to be assured that the companies they work with are in fact have proper controls in place. If you can see it, I just draw your attention to some of the terminology on the right side here in the evaluation itself. And if you say to yourself, I don't recognize some of this terminology, well, this is part of what we're all going to be experiencing because we're all going to be using AI in our work. So things like model design and training, model training, bias testing, all of these things here are now the part of the new vocabulary of business. And we learned that by building this out. We announced this in December of last year, and it made some news because made some news for several reasons. One, I think some people were surprised that companies are using data and AI to make workforce decisions. Secondly, they might have been relieved or skeptical that a group of large companies, large employers, had they themselves agreed to, in a way, self-regulate. One way of thinking about the safeguards, it's a kind of regulation that we created ourselves that we expect our vendor community to comply with. And some people think that that shouldn't be done by business, that it should be done by governments and so forth. And that's a good debate to have too. By the way, that gentleman is Ken Chenault, who is the co-chair of the Data and Trust Alliance, and Ken was until recently the CEO of the American Express Company and a very, very, very respected leader. I'd like to conclude by talking specifically to the students here. And you are citizens today and leaders tomorrow. Perhaps you're leaders today. You are going to be using data and AI as consumers and as professionals. You're going to be perhaps investing in AI in your companies or in your government work or NGO work. And we all have a shared responsibility to think about this new world. So I'd like to leave you with 5 questions to think about. And these questions are not related to the HR thing that I just talked with. They're much broader than that. And here's the first one. If you are going to invest, if let's say you're in a company in your job and you say, we need a system to help us predict what our customers will want. We need a system to help us predict if our supply chain is going to suffer disruption. We're going to either build it or we're going to buy it. That's a decision you're making. Here's a question though, is what is the real value of this system? Because you're going to find that lots of companies today are all saying, we use AI. We have AI in our product. We have AI. Maybe they do, and maybe they don't. But the question for you is it worth the risk of using a system to enhance our capability? Because there's always going to be the introduction of risk. It could be risk of bias. It could be a risk of fairness. It could be a risk of compliance. But you have to be mindful of the fact that you are taking on a new kind of risk. And is it in fact something you're ready to do? The second question is we never ask this question today with our technology. How many applications do you think you have on your phone right now? How many apps do you use on your phone or your laptop? Well, quite a few, right? You might ask, how good is the app? Does it have 5 stars? Does it have a lot of recommendations before you download it or buy it? But do you ever ask or even think to ask, who programmed that software? Who wrote the code? You wouldn't even think it, right? It's like, why is that relevant? It is highly relevant with AI systems. It is highly relevant because these models are models that learn, and the model that learns begins by being trained. It begins not by writing code. Well, there is code, but it is essential that these systems are trained before they go off into the real world where they learn through data coming in. Therefore, just like at American University, the faculty matter, right? You spend a lot of time and care in the faculty. You spend a lot of time and care on the curriculum, on the syllabus. Why? Because you're training people. And if you only hired men on your faculty, if you only hired men who went to the same 2 schools in the United States, do you think there might be bias in what the students learn? Well, reasonably, you might conclude there would be bias because of the who. Well, in the future, I think we're going to be very interested, if not required, to know, perhaps not by name, but by background, by capability, by expertise, by diversity, who builds these models, who trains the models, and who oversees the models. A question we simply have never thought to ask or even should ask with technology as we know it. Number 3, ask, was bias considered when the model was designed? Remember those questions I asked earlier in our talk about why do you buy what you buy and what determines your health? Well, you see, those questions are part of a hypothesis. So let's say we all started a company together that was going to be aimed at improving people's health. Let's say that whoever's on this lecture today, we are that company, and we're going to build this fantastic application powered by data and AI for health and wellness. The question is, Not, let's go get a bunch of data and find a needle in the haystack. No, that's not the way to think about so-called big data or AI. It's more, it starts with this. What is our hypothesis or thesis about health and wellness? Do we believe it's a function of exercise? Do we believe it's a function of pharmaceuticals? Do we believe it's a function of social, economic, environmental factors? You see, depending on our hypothesis, we will build our model accordingly. We simply won't look for data. We will say, we need, therefore, those data sets. Those data sets. When we make those decisions, we could be introducing bias, because if the only data sets that our system ingests are only about certain demographic groups or data that simply was available and we're going to use it, in building that model, in designing it, we could introduce bias. Number 4 is to monitor. That sounds boring, but remember, what's different about AI systems, among other things, that they learn by themselves. They learn. For our apps to change, what has to happen like every day? What happens to your apps almost daily? They get updated, right? Well, that means that somebody's had to put in bug fixes or enhancements to code, and then through the cloud, they get downloaded into our devices. AI systems are not updated by human beings alone. AI systems dynamically learn because they're always ingesting data. And through the data ingestion, they're seeing patterns change, they're making different predictions, hopefully more accurate predictions. And therefore, it isn't sufficient to audit or to check an AI system once. You have to monitor it on an ongoing basis. Finally, I come back to the new literacy. Now, I've been in the technology industry for a very long time, and IBM is more than 100 years old. I'm not. Hopefully you figure that out. But I've been with a company that's been through many technology cycles. And one thing that I've learned in seeing the introduction of the mainframe computer, and then the personal computer, and the mini computer, and the internet, and the smartphone, is the cycle. And one thing that happens when a new technology enters the mainstream of business and society is you see people do this a lot. They put quotation marks in the air to describe something. Now, again, some of you are too young to remember this, but in the 90s, at work and at home, people would say, what is this World Wide Web thing? What is this URL thing? What is a home page thing? What are these things? And it's because we didn't know how to describe. We need somebody to take care of that. Oh, a webmaster. And believe it or not, decades ago, I saw in IBM archives memorandums written that said things like, we need to work with universities to create a new field called computer science. We need to put our software in a new kind of a format called a database. Well, why do people do that? Either in memoranda, either written or with their fingers like I'm doing. It's because the vocabulary is emerging. One day it'll all get settled out, right? And we won't joke about computer science and cybersecurity analysts and database administrators. But for now, I literally see on Zooms and in meetings, people in business and in universities say, do this. There is a period of supervised training of the AI model. There is a period of unsupervised training. we need like data people. You mean data scientists? No, it's more like a data curator. We need a data curator. Oh, we need somebody to be responsible for, oh, we need a trainer. We need a trainer as a job, a trainer of a computer system, not a programmer, not a coder, a trainer. So what's happening here is all of us are going to be helping to form this new vocabulary, this new language of business and of society. And we need to do it quickly because it means our own competitiveness, and our own ability to be able to make responsible decisions, either as citizens or as professionals and as leaders. Well, that's a lot. So let me conclude now, and we'll move into the most important and interesting part of the discussion, at least for me, which is any observations you have, any feedback, and your questions. And I look forward to hearing from you.
I'm going to unmute myself and invite, I'm just trying to see where my chat, but there it is. Okay. Well, we usually start with nothing in the chat. And since we're a relatively small group, I'm just going to invite people who are on tonight. I see that Jackson already has his hand up. Anybody else? Jackson, you start. And Claudia has her hand up as well. Claudia's a faculty member, head of computer science at AUP, and one of the co-directors of this master's program. And I think I saw Jackson's hand up first. So why don't you go first?
Thank you so much. This was a super interesting talk. I have two questions. The first one relating to black boxes and bias within AI. I recently read something with they wanted like sovereign AI. They wanted localized data that followed an AI that followed the fundamental principles of the EU. What are your thoughts on kind of having like an AI basis for each country or sovereign countries?
Yeah, thank you, Jackson. It probably builds on the thought of data sovereignty, where data must stay within national borders or in certain regimes. I think the risk of AI sovereignty is bias. I mean, for example, I heard a colleague just this week say, when we declined to have our data shared to a company or to a health agency, when we say, no, I don't want my data to be shared, it sounds like we're doing something that's responsible. But if we deny these systems which learn from data sets, if we deny a diverse representative data set, those systems by definition will not have that reflected in what they learn. And I guess my concern about AI sovereignty is the homogeneous nature then of those systems. Maybe that's a very desirable thing, depending on the application. Maybe it's exactly what you want, but it needs to be thought through, because it's literally going to be denying those systems a more diverse data learning opportunity that goes obviously beyond those borders.
What is the argument for data sovereignty by country?
Well, there are several. One is it's an asset,
Right.
and therefore the asset should remain in sort of the market.
Mhm.
The other is control, that if I don't have control over the data, because it literally isn't here in within my borders, you could do things with the data that is contrary to my laws, regulation, and norms, and I don't want that to happen. There's even an argument for a kind of taxation, that if it's an asset class, then if it's sitting on servers in my regime, I can tax it. So there's lots of good arguments for it, and there are some good arguments against it, but it's a pretty well-known concept that is, controversial.
Jackson, did you have a second question before I leave you?
Oh, I do. I'm sorry. I recently took part in the war college with France, and I was able to talk with some of the officers about the use of AI in war. And I know this is kind of off topic, but they were talking about the creation of drone co-pilots that would fly next, or wingmen that would fly next to the actual like fighter pilot, and that they would basically, you could give it a command and it would follow it. And so I've already seen that at least in the military sphere, they're giving off commands to AI for that could impact human life. Is that something that, and I know you work only with really companies that work in like health and entertainment and banking, but what are your thoughts on the use of AI in war and an undesirable nature of AI? Sorry, that was a very long question.
No, it's a fascinating question, and it's a moral one and a personal one. What I would comment on, Jackson, is something that is really vital to this idea of decision support. So that it's interesting that he described it, or she described it, as a co-pilot. So if you think about that, whether it's my car that's going to be driving for me, or an AI system that's helping me hire, out of 500 job applicants, why should I hire that person? Or why should I extend a loan or approve a loan to that company? Why should I admit that student into American University of Paris and not the other 1,000 applicants or 10,000? See, those are all systems that aid my decision, right? Because you didn't say drone. You didn't say drone. Drone is, you do it. There might be somebody with a joystick, but an autonomous system is one where you're not helping me make a better decision, like flying that plane. You're doing it. When you're into that area of augmenting my decision, right, and making a better decision, this becomes very interesting in the experience of interacting with that system. So I don't want to go all deep and technical here, but I just ask you to think about this. The user experience with right, there's a lot of expertise in designing user experiences with our devices and with our websites and all that stuff, right? That expertise is mostly in service of a frictionless experience, right? One click, not three, make it intuitive, make it simple, make it delightful. But when it comes to decision support, do we really want frictionless, simple, easy? No, we don't. Certainly not in all cases. In fact, lots of peer-reviewed studies have been done already examining this very question of, when should I trust the system? When should I not trust the system? When do I defer to the system? When do I refuse to defer it? And now you're talking about a very, very interesting field of human behavior. Often, we think of behavioral science and particularly behavioral economics because it's the study of decision-making. And all I'll leave you with here is, I bet you if you went back to your colleagues in the military and said, what have you learned? When do the pilots trust the co-pilot, the autonomous? When do they not? Are there situations when they shouldn't trust the co-pilot? Are there situations when they should, but they don't? And the fact that they'll say, wow, it's really complex and it's not something we understand yet. This is part of the new literacy. You see, it's part of the new understanding, because we don't want to build systems where humans just mindlessly trust the system when they shouldn't. We want the appropriate levels of trust. And that is new. That's a new field. That's a new area that is waiting to be developed.
Great. That was
Makes
a
sense?
wonderful answer. Thank you for that. Claudia Roda, who's head of computer science at AUP.
Oh, hello. And thank you so much for your talk. It was incredibly interesting. And also the Data and Trust Alliance sounds like we need more of those. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm hoping that with our master program, we are actually addressing somehow the literacy problem that you were mentioning. And I would love to talk with you at some point, perhaps a bit more in detail, what you see as the literacy problem and how we can tackle that and prepare people. But my question, and perhaps I want to say another thing. I'm very, very happy to let everyone know that Jackson actually won an award as a future leader in privacy and data protection by the International Association of Privacy Protection. And I'm since it happened today, I thought I will let everyone know. But my question finally is about transparency and explainable AI. So when you talk about the sort of auditing that one may be doing with the systems, and you called it evaluation, perhaps is similar to what we call impact assessment. Do you think we can achieve that unless we truly have explainable AI?
Yeah, I think this assessment or this evaluation is in a way asking the same thing: is your AI explainable? And the thing is, we may not like your explanation. So the first question is it explainable? And it needs to be. And secondly, so explain it to us. Because once you explain it to us, we might say, oh yes, you have proper bias controls, you have mitigation controls, or it could be, we now understand it, thank you, but you have a problem with your system. So explainability is one piece of the answer, but it is not the only thing that is needed. The reason it links to literacy, Claudia, is we heard this from the companies, the HR professionals who are going to use the evaluation. They said when we finally finished it and we gave it to them to use, they said, we could ask these questions and we'll get the answers from the companies, but we won't understand them. We won't understand the answers, and we don't even understand some of these questions. And so we had to take an additional 3 months to build education for the HR professionals so that when they get these explanations, they can interpret them properly and evaluate their validity. That was the literacy gap.
May I ask a follow-up question? Especially when we talk about deep learning, one of the big area of research is to make sure that the system itself somehow can explain decisions and, for example, make explicit those variables that currently are not. Nobody knows what those variables are, right? The one that you were talking in the case of HR, for example, why you select this person and not the other. And that's still, we are still very far away to be able to create a system that uses deep learning or even other types of learning and produce a reasonable explanation. Do you think we eventually may get there, or just continue build something on top that does without the system explanation?
As I understand it, there are different ways of trying to evaluate whether a deep learning system is biased, but I do think some of our companies' conclusion is maybe they should not use systems that rely on deep learning for certain applications because it simply isn't safe to do so. And I prefer that answer, being a person who has seen the pattern of technology. It's simply not ready. You might conclude from just a business perspective, it is not ready to be put into production. It could, whether it's too vulnerable to cyber attacks, it doesn't scale, it's got too many bugs. In this case, it may be it's not explainable. And something that's not explainable isn't ready to be put into our business, at least for certain applications like people decisions. For example, you could argue that a deep learning system that is inexplicable in a supply chain scenario where its accuracy is very good, although we don't understand how it's able to predict supply chain disruption, But in that case, a company could judge that it's not something that is going to impact adverse impact on people, perhaps. I'm not saying that's a recommendation, but I could imagine companies going through that kind of rationale.
Thank you very much.
Ruth Corin, who is professor of mathematics at AUP.
Hi, thanks very much for what was a very interesting talk. I was very interested with the questions you suggested that students and us take away from the talk, particularly because a lot of them lined up a lot with some of the ways that I asked my students in statistics, particularly to think about data, which is to contextualize it. To think about what are the biases that are in the collection of the data, and to think about the actual context of the data itself, going along the, before they even start an analysis, to think about what the data says, and how it's been collected, who's collecting it, why it was collected, when it was collected, all these sorts of things. So contextualizing things, and this is really important. And so I'm very interested also, like Claudia, with this question of the data literacy, the data and AI literacy, and the new vocabulary that people should be learning about, and thinking how this can fit into the ways we're teaching. So I'm super interested to think more about that. And I also would love to hear what Claudia, to talk with Claudia again as well after this. But one of the things that you said in an answer to Jackson's question, I think, was that you said that, it's important when answering, you're asked to share data for example, a healthcare application or model or something like this. And it's important that people do share their data in order that we can have the most diverse collection of data. And I hear this because, we're trying to reduce biases in the data, in the original data to begin with. On the other hand, a lot of the time when people are asked to give up their data, they don't perhaps see this benefit of sharing their data for the good of the data set, but rather they're seeing that they're surrendering their data more for the good of the company that's collecting it, or that there's some underlying profit motive, rather than it being for improving the health of the community, or improving the way that people make decisions about what they buy and so on. So I'm sure there's some trade-off here that we have to keep in mind. But really, I'm more frequently saying to my students that they should not be sharing their data, that they should be, where possible, refusing cookies and so on. How can we make these choices? How can we keep it, in some sense, make a simple choice? When do we share our data? When do we keep it for ourselves?
Well, I'm with you. Thank you for that. I'm with you. In fact, until this week, I had never thought about the consequence, the sort of unintended consequence of my not sharing my data. I routinely say, don't allow, don't allow, don't allow, because I just don't want, if it's a simple microsecond decision, I'm not going to give a company my data because it hasn't explained to me like why it needs it. But when I heard that for the first time, I was like, I have to rethink that a bit. Now, I'm still going to refuse data as a personal decision. I'm not recommending this to to banks and to consumer companies by and large. But I shouldn't be so hasty when it comes to banks, for example, because just to chase that for a second here to illustrate my own thinking in real time. Like, well, why should I give my personal data to a bank? Well, on the other hand, I read a lot about the unbanked, the underserved, that have people or businesses that don't have good credit ratings, and therefore they're charged higher interest rates, they're charged higher fees, they're denied credit. And in a way, if those algorithms are trained on data that's not diverse enough, then I have to think about it more. So back to your question, I think part of it is we have yet to make clear what are the benefits of sharing data other than like personalized ads and stuff like that, which you'd say, thank you for explaining that to me. I don't want that. I don't want that. For things like healthcare or financial services or other aspects of things that we might value, I think companies and entities, including the government, might have to just do a much better job of explaining why they want the data and how it benefits, stakeholders. New area. Also, can they depersonalize the data? A lot of it is the promise of anonymizing the data and get, the PII stuff. I don't trust that yet, because I come from IBM. I know what you can do with encryption and identification and all that kind of stuff. So I would be very skeptical about promises of anonymizing data.
May I ask a quick follow-up question? So, because I think, perhaps this brings us to the question of company self-regulation or government regulation, right? Because in a way, the fact that in Europe there is the GDPR that says that there is a limitation of purpose, that companies cannot share the data freely. Once they collected the data, they have to throw it out after a certain amount of time. This may actually make it more likely that people share data for certain specific purposes and they feel safe because they know that there is a state regulation. So do you think that state regulation in general could be better than self-regulation, which, I mean, it's always welcome, but maybe as this drawback of leaving the doubt?
This is an eternal debate in business. By and large, businesses don't like to be regulated on anything. I think that's not tenable. That's not reasonable. Their accusation is that regulators create bad regulation and that they don't think through it enough. Like, for example, you can't share data. Well, what about healthcare and research? What about these kinds of things? But this blunt instrument was used. So to be very precise about this space, sometimes people call this precision regulation, where you regulate the use cases, but you don't regulate the underlying capabilities. So don't say you can't share data, do regulate how data sharing is applied. And some of that exists today in the United States. I mean, financial services and healthcare, big regulation about data sharing and things like that. But in unregulated industries like social media, they need some of that, right? So I think people are right to be skeptical of business self-regulation but they have to look into it. I would say after we announced our HR safeguards in December, we were contacted within 48 hours by the White House. So that's an interesting call to get. And we were contacted by the US Department of Labor separately, and we were contacted by the US Equal Opportunity Commission, and they were very interested in what they read in the New York Times. Well, I just want to say this, that we had a joint interagency briefing with the White House, the Department of Labor, and the EEOC. And what they wanted to know is the following. In your alliance, you have Walmart, which is the second largest employer in the United States. I said, yes. They said, well, the largest employer in the United States is us, the federal government. And we ourselves are using algorithms and data in our own workforce practices, but we don't have safeguards in place. So we'd like to see what you've developed because we may want to apply them ourselves. Well, that was obviously good to hear because they were looking for good regulation in a way. And so I'm just saying that it's possible that business can occasionally create good self-regulation, and that perhaps it can set the pace for other businesses. That's our hope, right? While we don't lobby, we do hope to be a good example. And other businesses have reached out to us, and we are giving away our safeguards to anybody who wants to implement them because it's just a good thing to do.
So I'd like to raise the issue of trust. I think it's very interesting that you included the word trust in the name of the data and trust. And we all know, those of us who study communications, brands, things like that, that actually consumers are becoming very demanding of the companies that they buy from, or that they have interaction with. Decisions on the part of companies, bad decisions perceived by buyers and by clients, can lead people to turn against. I'm thinking, because I've had a recent conversation with Seth about what happened at Spotify recently, remember? And there was a massive reaction on the part of a number of people who kept things, who were on the Spotify site. So it's interesting to me to think about businesses working toward achieving the public trust, or beginning to sort of establish a system whereby consumers can have trust in them based on how they handle data. So I'm just curious about how you evolved the title of this and why you chose the word trust.
Well, I think it's for all the reasons you mentioned here. Number one, I think these companies that came together acknowledge that we operate as companies through a license, explicit or implicit, that society grants us to operate. And society can revoke that license. They could regulate us into oblivion or burden and so forth if you don't do things that continue to earn the public trust, and as well as the trust of all stakeholders, including your employees. So one is, it was not even a debate that the core group of companies came together to say, if we don't do something about some of these unanswered questions, we are going to get regulated, and we should, because this stuff is pretty potentially here could cause a lot of harm. And so the trust was, I think, not a big debate. Now, how does one earn trust? There are some basic things, right? It's like corporate hygiene. You must comply. You must do things that are ethical, and you also have to be transparent. And this is where you can get into some very tricky areas, because transparency to some feel like disclosure, and disclosure could feel well-meaning, but it is not something that earns trust. So, for example, if I wanted to look at the terms and conditions of every app that I download, there is disclosure there. But if I bother to read, and I never do this, and who does? Am I really going to read all of the terms of service for everything that I use? Yeah. Do I revoke cookies constantly? So disclosure is not a guarantee of trust. And I come back to a question about explainability. I don't think explainability is going to be the silver bullet to trusting AI systems, because if it's not done properly, it's going to feel like disclosure. In other words, if I hit a button, you will share with me, this huge explanation that I can never understand, and I don't even know what it means. And, but it satisfies a requirement, either self-imposed or regulated. Mm-hmm. So the earning of trust is a perception, right? It's a transparency. It's a consistency of behavior. It is also whatever you promised me, you do, and you do it consistently. And when you mess up, that also is not something that's pried out of you. It's something you disclose. That's why I'm really, really interested in the question Jackson raised and the other conversation we had about explainability. In this area of AI, we don't want people to just trust us or the system. We want them to have the appropriate levels of trust in the system. And that sounds like a nuanced answer, but when you really think about, for example, one of our member companies is Pfizer. They are investing in a lot of AI systems to help physicians and consumers make good healthcare decisions. Does Pfizer want the physician to say, I didn't make the decision, that Pfizer application told me to prescribe that drug, and it turned out that it wasn't a good thing to do. I didn't make it. The algorithm told me to do it. Pfizer does not want that to happen, right? And it's because these are just things to help you make a better decision. And so that's a very calibrated new world that we're heading into of calibrated trust or appropriate levels of trust. So anyway, back to your question, Celeste. Yes, I think the good news is there's some companies that still want to act in the way that earns trust. In this new area, there's still a lot of new fields that we have to get into.
Can I ask a follow-up question that's kind of off the track, but I'm really curious. There's been a lot of noise this week and last week about Elon Musk buying Twitter. Since I'm sort of addicted to political Twitter and I kind of count on people whom I consider to be trustworthy purveyors of political information, I'm nervous about Elon Musk having that much control over a platform like Twitter. So what are your thoughts about that? I've read compelling arguments on both sides. Some people think that the company has really struggled with how to control hate speech, discrimination, other things like that, and that he actually might bring something that would improve that. Most people, on the left, on the political left, are terrified at the thought of one man holding so much control in his hands and feel that Twitter will no longer be a place where some conversations of, as you say, appropriate trust can be held. So have any thoughts on that? Think Twitter might join your alliance?
Well, let me step back away from the specific of Elon Musk and Twitter and slightly and get into two things that come to mind. One is the concept of stewardship. So Jeff Bezos, who was until Elon Musk, I guess the richest person in the world at one point, he bought the Washington Post. And people thought, oh, here we go. He's going to impose an agenda on the newsroom. And you can, I don't know whether, people feel that's happened or not. And Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation, imposing an agenda on all of the media properties. I think the same question can be asked of any individual who takes something, especially if they take Twitter private. Will any individual impose an agenda on what the content flow is? Now, set that aside. So that remains to be seen. I think it is much more difficult when it comes to social media platforms, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or any of the others. These are not neutral platforms. So for those of us who believe in free speech and freedom of expression with some boundaries around it, you'd say, well, then what's wrong with freedom of expression on Facebook or Twitter? Shouldn't everybody be free to express themselves, whether you agree with it or not? Well, that's a fair debate, but that is not what these platforms are. They're not neutral. They have algorithms embedded in the platform that, that it is not like I walk into a library and there are 100,000 books, and some of them you may say shouldn't be in the library, but I might say, look, I'm not afraid of different opinions. Let me decide whether I'm going to go to that shelf and read that book, but leave it in the library. That's not how these platforms work. These platforms are like a personal library that's been assembled for me that highlights certain books and excludes other books that I really would have to hunt for, right? That is not like synonymous with free speech and freedom of expression. That's why these things cannot be intermingled as if, I'm a champion of free speech, so leave me alone, because that's not how these platforms work. Because if they work that way, they wouldn't be making so much money. They make money because, companies want to find certain people, certain cohorts. They want to know about you. They want to target you. And those platforms can't do that unless they have this very, very powerful capability of targeting, retargeting, reinforcing, and all the rest. So all I'd say about Twitter is we'll see whether he'll be a neutral steward, and we'll also see how he navigates this, I think, impossible minefield of freedom of expression, but the reality of how these platforms actually work.
Yeah. Anybody else? What about from Alexandra, Jennifer, Amelia, or Sandra? Well, thank you so much, John. Really, what a pleasure it's been having you. And I particularly appreciated the time you took at the beginning to sort of lay out how AI works. I think, earlier in the year, we got some ideas that went back to the ELISA experiments in the 60s, but it was actually great to have an update today to look at some of these sophisticated systems and also to look at the ubiquity of it. I personally am not taking the master's in data science, so I wasn't aware of the absolute ubiquity of it. And I thought you did a beautiful demonstration of that, and also gave us some hope. I mean, I hope that all of you, the students especially, will take home those 5 questions. The PowerPoint will be available. And Jessica, do we post those on the website as well, the PowerPoint, or you can see it?
Part of the recording.
Suppose. You can see it in the recording. So I hope you'll remember those 5 questions. And it's a great place for us, I think, to end this series. And I hope that you, John, will send, your students and other people to the site to hear your lecture, and possibly some of the others here, and also to keep in touch with AUP, because AUP departments and our research centers do a huge number of lecture series, and we're actually archiving all of that now and making it available to the public. So thank you to the diehard students who hung in there all semester, and to your faculty members. And particularly to you, John, it's been an honor to have you with us tonight. Thanks a lot.
A real
Thank you.
A real
Thank
pleasure.
you very much.
Real pleasure.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.